Entrepreneurs, when they succeed or they die, they'll die from death of a thousand cuts. It's like everything that affects them. It's regulations, red tape, it's the tax policies, it's capital access, but it's also things like accessibility of healthcare. So many people want to start businesses but don't because of healthcare access. Childcare. So many people want to start and build businesses but can't get easy access to childcare.
UnLost Cause is a community that shares stories of individuals 40 and beyond who found the courage to reclaim their dreams and live without regrets. I'm David New, and I hope these stories help you find joy, purpose, and passion in a life true to you. All right. Well, welcome, Victor Hwang, CEO of Right to Start, to the UnLost Cause show. And I'm super excited to be chatting with you today. And my first question is, oftentimes a lot of people have dreams and passions in life, and it starts in childhood. So can you share a little bit first about your upbringing and perhaps your first brush with entrepreneurship?
Well, thank you, David, for having me here. And entrepreneurship is something that I didn't realize that not everybody has this experience, but I kind of got to breathe it in throughout the course of my life, even at a young age. So my parents came from Taiwan and they were immigrants, but when we'd go back to Taiwan, I would see my grandfather who ran a little retail store in a small town. And so I always just saw, that as something that people could do. It wasn't something that was unusual to be able to run your own thing. And then as I was growing up, my parents came to the US, they came to live the American dream. And one of the things that happened when I was in high school was I was fortunate enough to get into Harvard, but my parents couldn't afford to send me because they were educators. And so one of the things the first thing they did was take a second mortgage out on their house. And so they put everything they owned on the line. But the other thing they did was they started a business on the side to be able to afford to bring in some extra income that could basically pay for college. And so they did it. And it started in the nights and weekends and eventually grew into a business that was able to pay for college for myself and my sister. And so I saw the transformation of how running your own business could actually uplift the lives of those around you and those you care about. I also saw the impact of what that did for all the other people in the company. It created lots of jobs for a lot of people. I also saw what it did for Austin, Texas, which is where we were in the time. And I saw how entrepreneurship and all the other companies coming out of there, from Dell Computers to Whole Foods to South by Southwest, and just the explosion of entrepreneurship and how it really transformed the shape of an entire city. At the same time, I saw how hard it was on them and the challenges and the struggles they had to deal with, and all the things that become kind of easy for you as you've gotten into business, even like what's an LLC, what's an S Corp, what's a C Corp, how do you set up a bank account, how do you even make your first product, how do you sell your first customer, how do you do accounting, all these things that seem so simple later are just so extraordinarily hard and intimidating for people in the beginning. And then not to mention the barriers that are imposed from how complicated the regulatory structure is, to the government contracting system, to the nature of capital and how much personal risk is involved in the difficulties of the way the capital markets work. And so I saw all that, and I think that really became an inspiration for me for the rest of my life. So I've been involved in entrepreneurship now for many, many years, whether as a founder, but also as an investor, have sold companies, have closed down companies. But then I got into this question of, what about at large? How do you build and support entrepreneurship for everybody? And that's really been the 25 years of my life, is in and around entrepreneurship and supporting entrepreneurship in so many ways because of the impact of what I saw on my parents and the lives of those around them. And I saw, entrepreneurship can lift lives and create wealth that lasts and ripples across an entire economy. But also, it's extraordinarily harder than it needs to be. And there's a lot of barriers, and it's a very unlevel playing field for people. And so I think entrepreneurship, watching that happen close to me, even from a young age, has really shaped my life profoundly.
Wow. Well, that's an amazing story. And Victor, my parents also immigrated from Taiwan, and they did a side hustle as well when myself and my two sisters were entering into college to help source some materials for a family business that our uncle ran in Taiwan. And that actually made the difference to either we could go to school or be burdened with loans or not. So yeah, very similar to you. I had a similar story with my parents trying to make ends meet and more to support us on the way to, help our dreams come true.
Well, immigrants have this kind of hustle mindset, right? Like, you'll figure it out. If you're already willing to move entire countries, there's a sense that there's got to be a path. You find a way to get to the solution, no matter how challenging it is. But I think that's not everybody. In fact, once you grow up, you realize it's actually the exception rather than the rule of people that actually think and breathe like that.
So, you just mentioned how your parents hustled and started a business to help support you. And so you've seen the positives and so also the struggle. And if I remember correctly, when you went to college, you studied law and became a lawyer thereafter instead of going down an entrepreneurship route, right? It almost feels like, were you supporting entrepreneurs or were you just like, oh, that was just a sideshow and it didn't really come front and center in your mind about maybe coming back to that down the road?
Well, my journey intellectually and kind of professionally was I always cared about, and part of this I think was being a child of immigrants. And, I'd always see like the differences between places I grew up in, whether it was in Austin or Indiana, or I was born in Louisiana. We lived in Iowa. We moved around a bit. But then going back to Taiwan, and Taiwan in the 1970s and the 1980s was not the place it is now. It was pretty rough at times. It was still, there was a lot of development yet to be done back then. And so the question of why are some places prosperous and other places not? Why do some places provide opportunities and others don't? That was always just a backdrop of my upbringing. It was just a question I thought about a lot. And so going through college, I studied government because I thought, well, that's how you do it. That's how you actually tackle these big questions. And then I went to law school thinking, well, the lawyers are the ones that know how to do this. They surely know how to create wealth at scale and they know how to build prosperity. And if you do great work, you can learn to make a real impact. And I think it took a few years of journeying through that where I started to realize actually it's not the wealth and prosperity doesn't come from government. Government can enable it. The law can enable it, but it really comes from private actors who build stuff and they see problems. They find ways to fix it. And they build products and services and solutions to innovate and make things better than they were before. And then if it's successful, it grows and it scales and it creates a lot of ripple effects across an entire system. It took a while to get that because that's not actually the way that we're taught. If you study economics in college or in law and economics, that's actually not how it generally is thought of. It's actually, if you think of the way economics is done, individuals are kind of cogs in the system. We're just replaceable. We're fungible goods or commodities. If a company fires people here, those people just move somewhere else. They hire different people. If an entrepreneur doesn't start a business, somebody else will. It's no big deal. But that's not how reality is. And I learned that actually what individuals do, at the level of micro or even nano scale of individuals trying to build something, make things better in the world, that's actually a very inefficient system. The breakdowns in social networks, the breakdowns in trust, in culture, in capital access, and accessing other resources, those all have an effect. And they have a huge effect at scale across an entire economy if you really look at it. And I realized, well, it's a complex system that really hasn't been described. And so my work really moved into that field, which is it's not so much anything I ever really studied. The law and government inform that, but watching how innovation happens, watching how value is created, watching how enterprises are built, watching how technologies move from research and laboratories into experiments to prototypes to commercialization, watching ideas come from all different shapes and sizes growing up, you really start to realize how little that gets taken into account in day-to-day sort of governance. And so that's led so much to my work today, where I kind of have just learned as I've gone through my own, and I was fortunate enough to get the training where I learned the disciplines of how people create wealth at the governance level or society, or how legal scholars think of creating legal systems. But I realized that the systems of creating prosperity and wealth are actually very primitive we have, and they miss out on a lot of really important things.
So you're studying policy and government and legal studies, and then you go into law. And then after that, it looks like your career went into venture. Would that be the right way to characterize it? It seems like you're very strategic and methodical about how you describe the macro and micro economy of entrepreneurship. So I would imagine that you take that same thoughtfulness when it comes to your career. Was that also intentional to go into like venture to see how, quote unquote, the sausage is made from the ground floor up?
No, I mean, it's always easy in hindsight, right? It all looks like genius. Like, man, how strategic and brilliant I was. No, it was really, I would say it was like, I think of it as like a river. So you think of a river flowing from the source down to the ocean. And at the ocean, I thought my entire career has been trying to move up the river to figure out the source of where the river starts. And so I started thinking around government and law and policy as like the solution to create the wealth and the prosperity I wanted. As I moved up the river, I realized, and this was the late 90s and the early 2000s, well, it's technology. I mean, you need technology because technology is the main driver of a lot of that. It's innovation. And so I left the law to actually run a nonprofit organization, which was a public-private partnership between the state of California and the business sector to commercialize technologies coming out of universities, research laboratories, government R&D to innovate, to find new opportunities and to bring those new technologies to life. So I got involved in that. And then I realized, well, it seems to be a big problem here on capital because everyone talks about the need for capital to commercialize and bring new innovations to the market. And so I started a venture studio. They weren't even called venture studios back then, but that was over 20 years ago, which was a little tiny company with a little fund, which built companies, invested in companies, put deals together. And we had some successes and others not, but I learned a lot around capital formation. But once you get into the capital business and did some venture capital work, I realized actually it's not capital at all. Like everyone points to capital because it's like an easy criminal. Like it's like everyone's like the culprit, like we need more money. But ultimately there's money everywhere. The question is, well, how does money become capital? And why isn't there more capital when there's money everywhere? Like what is the mechanism by which money becomes structured in forms to be put at risk, to invest into new things? And why in some places is there more of that? And why in some places is there less of that? And you realize all of these things are constructs, right? Everything that we create, everything has been made by mankind in some way or other, whether it's capital or technology or innovation or markets. And then once I realized that, I realized ultimately it's all in the stories we tell. Like that's sort of at this, once you finally get up to the source of the river, you realize the narratives that provide the culture and provide the assumptions that shape the attitudes of our daily behavior actually are what lead to environments where you have thriving entrepreneurial activity and those that are not. And I ended up spending a decade in Silicon Valley trying to move up to the source of that river. And in the Valley, I found the real difference is not that they've got lots of tech. There are a lot of places with a lot of raw technology. It's not that they got lots of money. That money wasn't there at one point. And in the 70s, at one point, there was like almost no venture capital. They had some bad years there and the VC industry almost disappeared. So we're talking like half a century ago, there was zero money. And so what was there? You really dig into the history of it and you realize it was the way that people behaved. It was the way they acted. And you see it now. If any coffee shop in Silicon Valley is very different than a coffee shop, say, in most other parts of the world, where in the coffee shop in Silicon Valley, something's happening in every shop. Someone's sketching ideas on a napkin with someone. They're prototyping something. They're pitching an investor deal. They're building out a product. They're making referrals, introductions. They're sharing ideas. There's constant energy. And you go to other places, and I've spent enough time in other parts of the country and the world to realize ultimately that they don't have that, or they have some lesser version of that. And I moved to one city once, and I've moved around a lot. And in Silicon Valley, when you move there and you start talking to people, usually the answer is, what are you working on? How can I get involved? How can I help you? That's sort of the immediate set of questions that follow. You move to most cities, it's like, why are you here again? And what is it you're trying to do? I don't get it. Well, that seems really hard. Are you sure? Are you sure you want to do that? Like, I know people who've tried that before. That doesn't seem like a good idea. And you just hit all of these little stumbling blocks and you realize ultimately what's in people's hearts and minds actually shapes the economy at large. When the behaviors in a coffee shop, people working on a product together, people joining a new enterprise, trying to innovate something, all that adds up across millions and millions of conversations in an economy, and it has a fundamental effect on the whole thing. So anyways, that really started to dawn on me. And really, within just a few years of being in the Valley, I realized everything that economists and leaders are taught about how to create prosperity, it totally misses that. They don't fundamentally understand where Silicon Valley comes from. Therefore, you cannot create long-term prosperity at scale without taking into account all those factors, right? All those layers of how things happen.
Wow. No, that's super interesting. I want to make sure I come back to it. But the other stop in your illustrious career was at the Kauffman Foundation. And being a entrepreneur and associated with EO and YPO, I hear a lot about the Kauffman Foundation and all the good that it does. What did that particular stop teach you? Because it's quite fascinating when you're telling these little vignettes that they all seem to come together in this like puzzle that you've been piecing together over your career. So I'm curious, like what you learned during your stop in Kansas City.
9 years ago now, the Kauffman Foundation gave me a call. So I was in Silicon Valley at the time doing this work, and they were looking for someone to run the entrepreneurship department. And so for those of us that have kind of been around this world for a while, the Kauffman Foundation has really been the preeminent philanthropy and entrepreneurship now for about 3 decades, over 3 decades now. The legacy of Ewing, Marion Kauffman has really had so much effect in the world. I know EO basically got a huge lift from the Kauffman Foundation and probably wouldn't even exist today if it wasn't for the foundation. And that's been the case for so many organizations that have been involved in entrepreneurship and activities. We actually don't fully appreciate the impact that Mr. Kauffman's legacy has had on entrepreneurship in America. So it was a real privilege to get to do it. And I learned a ton, ran that work for 4 years. And I think the big thing that I learned was that when you're in entrepreneurship and sort of that sector around entrepreneurship, there's a lot of energy around it. Everyone loves entrepreneurship. But I came to realize that it was kind of its own bubble, that entrepreneurship outside of sort of that world of people who care about entrepreneurship wasn't really talked about, because we actually built one of the first, we had an amazing team of people we put together at the Kauffman entrepreneurship team. And one of the things we did was put together the first ever policy agenda around American entrepreneurship at all levels, at the national level, the state level, the local level. And what was remarkable was it was the first time anyone had ever done that. If you think about how important entrepreneurship is in all of life, in human prosperity and human progress, to have never put together a fully comprehensive policy agenda on how to support it and shape it across the country, that had no one done it before was shocking. And so we did it, and we were the first ones to do it. We ended up with over 200 coalition partners all signing on to this agenda. And the idea was entrepreneurship is not something that can be solved with another program or one tax cut or one little subsidy or one little tweak of a program here or there. It's a 360-degree problem, because entrepreneurs, when they succeed or they die, they'll die from death of 1,000 cuts. It's like everything that affects them. It's regulations, red tape, it's the tax policies, it's capital access, but it's also things like accessibility of healthcare. So many people want to start businesses but don't because of healthcare access. Childcare. So many people want to start and build businesses but can't get easy access to childcare. One issue that hardly gets talked about is home mortgages. Entrepreneurs, once you started a business, you cannot get a home mortgage for a long time because it's built entirely on a payroll system. So they look at your W-2s. They won't look at your 1099s, your sole proprietor income. You can be a profitable company, a very profitable company, but if you've only been doing it for a year and a half, that's not good enough for the lenders. It's all messed up.
Yeah. And there's also some bifurcation, right? If you're a well-funded VC-backed, Silicon Valley-backed entrepreneur, there are certain private lenders who will lend to you based upon your reputation or your net worth to get you a mortgage that's more in line with what the normal W-2 person can get for a 30-year fix. But for everyone else, it's extremely hard, having gone through it myself. So I think that you're right. Those are things that people just don't think about and I don't think policymakers did that to punish. It was just the best, and no one ever thought about it.
We have a lot of vestiges, because if you think about America really came of age sort of 100 years ago, right? Post-World War II, America sort of hit its moment. And so a lot of the systems we have now were designed for an industrial age post-World War II. So from our lending system, our mortgage system, our healthcare systems, our childcare systems, our economic development strategies, all those were kind of designed sort of in America, sort of when America really grew up, because they had to build all these systems. We essentially have now entrepreneurs, Americans, trying to build 21st century companies in a 20th century governance and political system. So if you think about home mortgages, that's one, right? It's from an era when people were payrolled. And so they base your home lending on your payroll, as opposed to home lending on your ability to pay back on all kinds of revenue you can earn. You think of similarly economic development for half a century now. The way that cities and states spend tens of billions of dollars to build their economies is by trying to attract a big company to build a plant or a warehouse or a distribution center. That is still the primary top-down economic development strategy of America and the world. It needs to shift, and it's actually shifting right now. So part of the work of Right to Start and the work I've been doing is how do you shift all these systems now? So economic development systems now, just in the last few years, this is one example, the economic development industry has created a new acronym. It's called Entrepreneur-Led Economic Development. That acronym never existed before a few years ago, or it wasn't really used. Now it's really spread like wildfire in the last few years. And fortunately, some of the work I've seen and been involved with has helped shape that movement. But it's remarkable it took until now to actually do that, right?
Yeah. And one question that jumped to my mind is you're talking about hey, people are trying to build 21st century companies, but they're in like this 20th century, like rules and regulation. What is an example of like a city or a country or state that's doing it well? Would an example be like how some of these countries are providing these digital nomad visas for easier access and trying to get that entrepreneurial talent? Would that be an example of something that is progressive or thought leaning forward?
Sure. Actually, the most famous country is Estonia because it's essentially a fully digitized economy where everybody carries a digital wallet as their form of ID. It's how they do business with the government. You can basically apply for a startup nomad visa almost instantaneously, and they can make decisions almost instantaneously now. It's a remarkable example. Estonia is, though, a small place, and so that often gets trotted out as that can't be done anywhere else. And the answer is, and I've actually talked to the folks who've been involved in that work in Estonia a number of times, and that model has actually, here's how they do it, is they basically apply the principles of modern software development, design thinking, and lean to the problem. It's not rocket science. And so the question is, how do we actually get in the business of applying that? If you think of like, who's the user of a government? Well, ultimately, it's the citizen, and ideally, it's the person who creates value in the economy. And so what is the user experience of that person trying to create value in an economic system? So if you think of the innovator as the user of an economy, how do we break down the barriers for them? How do we make it lean, right? How do we kind of custom fit the experience of building value to their problems? And right now we don't, right? We kind of think of them as separate problems. Like, red tape is sort of red tape. They want to cut red tape by cutting pages out of government like laws. That's not the same as making something user friendly. You can actually have something really short that is really crappy to use. And there's no focus on user experience. And that's the goal. So one example, you were asking an example, is the state of Colorado. So about 12 years or so, Governor Hickenlooper, who's a former entrepreneur, helped pass a series of laws in California called the Smart Performance Act laws. He basically said all of Colorado government shall use basically performance improvement standards like lean. It even called out lean performance. And so now every government agency in Colorado actually has lean performance standards. And in fact, it gave rise to a whole secondary industry of lean training at the universities and at the city level. They actually have academy. Denver is an academy called the Peak Academy that trains city officials from all across the country on how to use lean models in their city government performance. And I've actually met cities where they've done that, and it's had a huge effect on like the ability of entrepreneurs to start and grow businesses. In fact, I took a cross-country road trip last fall. I was in South Bend, Indiana, and I was in a town where I kept asking the entrepreneurs, like, what are the challenges of government here? And they all said none. They were raving about it. Like, what? I've gone to like another planet. Why is everyone so happy with the government here? And then I eventually met the woman who runs the startup like work for South Bend. And I mentioned, what are you doing that's causing all the entrepreneurs to love the city so much? And she said, well, thank you very much for saying that. We do lean. In fact, we all go to the Peak Academy in Denver to train regularly to learn how to do it. And so that's what happens. You can actually you can make us an environment very entrepreneur friendly by using modern principles of performance improvement. This is not rocket science, but we don't think about it that way generally. And we need to do that for entrepreneurs.
Wow, that's inspiring. Okay, so now I want to transition to Right to Start. Tell me first the year to 3 years and what you were doing before you jumped into starting Right to Start, because I want to focus on what were you doing beforehand and then that transitional moment, because I think a lot of people who listen to the UnLost Cause show, they have this like burning desire. They put either from childhood or they put some puzzle pieces together in their mind. For some reason, just thought they couldn't do it or they shouldn't do it or the timing's not right. But then they make that leap and typically and they feel like they have agency and power to turn a lost cause into unlost cause, right? So share with the audience what you were doing beforehand, and then let's talk about that transition to Right to Start.
Well, I was actually at the Kauffman Foundation right before that. And at the Kauffman Foundation, I'm an entrepreneur at heart. And when I realized that the problems I was seeing in the world were things that a foundation could not really do, I saw an opportunity to do something different because we could build a policy agenda for the country and we could get a lot of people to adopt it. It dawned on me, and you can only see this perspective when you're at a place like the Kauffman Foundation. You're kind of at 30,000 feet. You can see all these different things. I realized, well, who's going to implement this? And hit me that there was no infrastructure to operationalize these ideas. And if you think about every issue that matters in American life, other than entrepreneurship, there's been some kind of operational infrastructure to make it happen. So people that believe in guns rights have the NRA on the ground advocating, organized to lift up that issue of guns rights. People that believe in civil liberties have the ACLU on the ground, state to state, lifting up that issue, fighting for that everywhere across the country, on and on. AAA, if you drive a car, they're organized and fighting for you at the federal level and the state level to make sure it's easier to drive a car. For entrepreneurs, there really hasn't been that organized effort from the bottom up. And so I realized, all right, this needs to get done. And this happens a lot with entrepreneurs or innovators. I've learned this now, where at some point you look around and say, all right, somebody ought to do this. You like, well, who's going to do it? And you realize there's no one else. You're like, was it there? Over there? And you realize there's no one else to do it. And it's like, oh, crap. Like, if it's not me, then no one's going to do this.
So was that like a slow burn buildup when you made that realization that you had to jump? Or was there some triggering moment where you're like, ugh, I just can't stand it anymore. I have to do something about it?
I think it's a slow build where you realize that it's interesting. Like, as I've moved up that river, right, to the source of the problem, every time I've gone up further up the river, I think, all right, I'm finally getting to a place where we can solve all this, right? Like coming out of Silicon Valley to get the honor of going to the Kauffman Foundation, I thought, all right, a multi-billion-dollar philanthropy, we can solve this now, right? And you get there and you realize, everything is just another tool, and it's just a philanthropy. Like, it's not. It isn't. There's no silver bullet. Tremendous resources, tremendous networks, tremendous people, but they can't build an operating infrastructure on the ground to do organizing. And so, at some point, it dawns on you that, my gosh, like these problems are so multidimensional, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to see the things I've seen and know the people I know and have the insight I have. And I actually had people tell me this, like, Victor, if you don't do this, there's no one else is going to do it. I honestly did not believe them for a very long time. I was like, well, that's ridiculous. Like, how could that possibly be? But then after a while, it's like, well, who else? And you keep looking for someone else. And we gave grants to people to do it. And you realize, well, but who can really pull it all together? And you realize eventually, and this happened over and over every time I've been in my life where I've tried to do the next thing, you realize, tag, you're it. Like, you are the one. Whether or not you wanted it, it's yours to take if you want it. You don't have to. It's not an easy life, but if you want this to be solved, it's up to you.
Yeah. So you mentioned that, a sterling background and education, it's still not easy. So what would you say, like, maybe the two hardest challenges when you initially made that jump to lean into Right to Start?
Oh, man. I'll tell you, every time I've done something different, it is inevitable you get all the naysayers, right? And some of them will be upfront about it. Others will be passive aggressive about it. But most of the people, the vast majority of people I talk to are like, I don't quite get it. Like, do we need this? And you get that a lot with stuff.
Can I ask a quick question? Are the people, the naysayers, are they entrepreneurs or are they non-entrepreneurs who ask that question?
Both.
Really?
Both. Yeah. Well, because this issue in particular is kind of a weird one, right? It's not starting a business, and it's not even the policy shift. It's the advocacy around changing the civic infrastructure and building the advocacy system, which is it's like meta level of like insight. And it just sounds, to a lot of people, it just like doesn't make sense. I had people say like, oh, there's already a great small business lobby. You can't really build anything new. Oh, you should just hire a bunch of lobbyists. Oh, it's only national. Just go to Washington, D.C. Others are like, oh, too many cities, too many states. It's impossible to solve. There's just so many reasons not to do it. And it's like so many things. Like, until the iPhone was made, no one believed there was an iPhone. Like, until you build something new that hasn't existed before, no one believes it was needed in the world. And then once you build it, then most people are like, it's the crossing the chasm problem, right? It's Jeffrey Moore. You get the early folks who are like, oh, wow. But that's like 1% of the population, right? Where they're like, that's exactly what the world needs. I'm willing to join you on that crazy idea. The majority of people are like, I'll believe it when I see it, or I'll understand it when I see it. That's what I found absolutely to be the case with this.
So if that's the case, then early on, you get this onslaught of like second guessing about your idea. How does that impact you? Do you start second guessing yourself, or does it embolden you and you're like, you know what? I'm going to prove you all wrong. I've seen this. I've done my research. I've lived this. Or, because it can push people one of two ways. So I'm just curious how it impacted you.
You do second guess yourself. I mean, you're only human, right? Even if you think you're emboldened, part of you thinks maybe they're right. You can't help but not think like, maybe I'm the crazy one here. But I've been through this before. So I kind of know the drill, which is in the beginning, you're going to get all the reasons not to do it. You realize that's just the way it's going to be. And then you start to expect it. You realize, all right, if I get a yes, I'm actually thrilled, because then you realize you don't go in expecting a bunch of yeses. You go in expecting a bunch of nos, and you realize then you get to the glass is half full instead of half empty, right? So being in Silicon Valley was very helpful for a bunch of reasons, because I realized that the game is never over. Like, you spent a lot of time around that network. You're only as good as your next company, right? Even people that have made it and have been successful, even made some money, like, they're irrelevant like the next day, pretty much. And I remember people would come to me asking, to help or for advice in Silicon Valley. And I had people come to me looking for help on raising money for their startup. And they used to be on the Midas list of like top venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. And I realized, my God, they're still in it. And they were on the Midas list once. They've probably got enough to not work, but they're still in it and they still don't know how to figure it out. And once you're in the valley and you realize the game is never over, the most successful people can be brought down and humbled the next day, but they're willing to do it. Like, it doesn't stop them. They just get back in it because they're in it for the game. They just love that process of like constantly building and hunting. And you realize we're all in it. A lot of people on the outside look at the valley and think, well, a handful of companies with a lot of money, a handful of VCs with a lot of money. On the ground floor, that's not what the valley looks like. On the ground floor, what the valley looks like is people like hustling and innovating and trying new things out all the time, and it never stops. And most of it is it's getting rejected and hitting all the walls, but they find a way. And then when you realize this is the real Silicon Valley, then you realize, well, I can do that too. Like, there's nothing magical about that. That's just a stamina, flexibility, determination, willingness to learn, absorbing all the information and contacts and ideas you can fast, and adjusting and constantly trying to find your way fluidly through all this. So anyways, I don't know, it's a long answer to your question.
No, that's great. And so one of the questions I always love to ask is like, how much planning did you have to do before you jumped? And that could be financially, talking to your partner or your family, could be emotionally, physically, support systems, because I think a lot of people, one of the reasons that holds them back is there's a lot of reasons to not do it. Check those boxes, right? So then they're like, oh, well, Victor did it because he had all these boxes checked and it was easy. He had a bunch of money, his wife or partner was supportive. Like, so I'm just curious, like, how much of that did you have to plan versus also, having a blind leap of faith as you thought about making that decision?
Well, get the home front together, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, you do not surprise your spouse, with this kind of stuff, right? It's not just high risk. It's draining, like your time and your emotions, your energy. This is going to take a lot out of you. And you want someone who's with you for a while and who believes in it and is willing to go with it and knows that this could take a few years to really get going. So you've got to have enough runway, enough cash to say, look, this could go for 2 or 3 years or whatever you've got, right? If it's a year, that's fine. If it's 6 months to test it out, raise some money, that's fine too. Most things probably take like a year or two to really get going, at least, but some people get luckier and sometimes it goes faster and you never know. And there's different paths, but yeah, get a plan, man. You have to make sure you've got your healthcare in place, make sure you got your family and friends are on board. You got to get some of the basics down because you're about to take a leap off into the unknown. I think that's right. There's a lot of people that, I used to be pretty cocky about this. I always thought, well, I can do it faster than everybody else. And the truth is, I did not. Like, everything takes 3 times as long. Takes 2 to 3 times as long. Costs twice as much, at least 2 to 3 times as much. Everything is just hard, and because the world is messy, and you can never plan perfectly. But you do need to plan and make the best plans you can, which will change inevitably. But make the best plans you can.
Yeah, and they talk about, it takes a village, right, to like support an enterprise or entrepreneurial dream. I'm curious, what type of support networks did you have in terms of role models, mentors, or other entrepreneurs to help you in the invariable, dark days that we all hit as entrepreneurs? And probably a lot of listeners will probably be like, ooh, I'm going to be concerned about that. But the sun always comes up. But sometimes, we need that support network. So I'm just curious what your support network was like back then and even today.
That's great. I've learned through having been through this a few cycles now. the first thing you do is to find a great group of people around you on this stuff. And to know that actually a few of them will leave along the way because the idea will change and it won't, their lives will change, the directions will change, whatever. But to start with a great group of people, and I've been fortunate. Actually, we've still got a few of the OGs at Right to Start from the very first few days of this effort that really joined when it was just like, hey, I've got an idea. Like I didn't even have like much of a written plan. It was like very, it was kind of a crummy plan and it was just sketches and a terrible logo and wasn't even sure about the name, at that point. And it was just like, I've got an idea. And a number of the people, at least three of the four people from the very beginning are still with us because they believed in the idea back then. And so you need that, right? And their roles have, adjusted and grown and shaped over time. But you need a few people that are willing to just believe in this thing because it's a very lonely journey when you're doing this stuff. Some people collect baseball cards or whatever. I collect great people to work with. And that is one benefit of getting older. There's plenty of downsides to getting older, but the older you get, you start to build a really great collection of awesome people. And you also get much better at understanding people and filtering people, right? And knowing how to work with people. And so I've had the benefit of that now over half a century on this planet. And you've been through a few reps on this thing. You kind of know what it looks like and you know what great people look like. And the entrepreneurial startup journey of any kind, whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit or whatever, is hard. And you want people that have that stamina and resilience to go with you. And there's no room for ego or pride or hubris or formality, like passive aggressiveness or mixed motives. You want people that are just straight up, just great to work with. And those are not easy to find, to be honest. Like, really hard to find great people.
Yeah. And Right to Start has been around for 5 years now. Is that right?
Yeah, 4.5 was when we launched, but we're working on this 5 years now.
Got it. And if you had to teleport back in time and say, hey, Victor, here's a hint or two to make this journey a little smoother, anything that you would whisper to yourself back in when you were starting out from ground zero?
Oh, wow. So much. I mean, we've learned so much along the way. Probably one thing is just to, be ready for it to take a while because what we're building is kind of different and unique. This sort of national advocacy platform for the voice of entrepreneurs. And it took a while for people to really get it. And I would say, and for us to figure out what exactly it is on our side too. Like, how do you productize a concept, right? It's sort of an amorphous concept of, how we can change our system, but we have to productize it. So we still think like entrepreneurs and startups. We still think of product. We still think of value. We still think of margins. We still think of COGS. I mean, all this stuff is like the startup language and discipline we still bring in, but it's a slow, hard process because it's not like you can build an app and test it, send it to some customers and get their survey feedback, right? This is like slow feedback cycle stuff. Like, there's not a lot of great models and examples. We're just constantly learning internally. Like, did that work? I don't know. It takes time for it to really get out there to see what the effect of something is. So slow feedback cycles, hard to define whether something was effective or not. It's also the case where the entrepreneurs don't pay for it, right? Because you need philanthropies, sponsors, donors to pay for it. And so it's more like insurance where you have the money comes from one place and the beneficiaries are another place, which adds in like a whole other level of like startup complexity to the whole thing.
Yeah, because I would imagine that I didn't even think about it. Is that the slow feedback loops, like, is it working or not? Because one of the benefits about being an entrepreneur is like, well, you don't even have a product, but just put the dream product on like Facebook ads or PPC and just see if people click through and sign up for a wait list. If they do, there's probably some latent demand. But yours is like, you've got this idea, you have to set up meetings, you have to pitch it, see if the policymakers or elected official like it, then, does it gain any traction? So that is almost the antithesis of entrepreneurship because of the slowness or the way that the system is set up, right? I would imagine it is frustrating at times.
It's just a different customer base. It's like, I mean, SpaceX sells to government, so you can build businesses in sort of these slower feedback markets, but it is challenging. And that's just one of our customer bases, right? We also are actually trying to build out, and this is actually a need we have right now, is to really advance our digital engagement piece because we want citizens to show up to speak up on these things. And amazingly enough, the citizenry doesn't even know that entrepreneurship is an issue. Like when you poll Americans, like what are the top issues and concerns in America that we need to deal with? Crime, healthcare, economy, jobs, all that stuff. Entrepreneurship is nowhere on that list. Nowhere on the list. And even the entrepreneurs don't even think it's like an issue to care about. Because the thing is, a lot of those things we're told to care about are constructs of like media narrative, right? Like, oh, you should care about these things. So the media narrative, the constructs of what we're told is important in America has not involved entrepreneurship and supporting that and its role in American life. So we've actually got to provide an entire counter narrative as well. Then that's like another issue we got to deal with, which is how do you create a counter narrative for a different audience?
Because to some extent, because we just established entrepreneurship is hard, is the lay public may think, well, it's hard. So if they want to do it, it's not easy to start a business. So they have to figure out the red tape, the regulations. That's just part of being an entrepreneur.
It's like hazing.
Yeah.
It's like hazing, right? We've come to expect it.
Yeah. So now I want to focus more on right to start, right? And you described that as like the ACLU for entrepreneurship, right? What does that mean in practical terms? And what is the North Star, the ultimate vision for the organization as when the things start falling?
So we seek a world where everyone can realize their fundamental right to start. And we think of the right to start, the ability to access entrepreneurial opportunity, as a basic human right. Just like you have a right to speech, you have a right to worship, you have a right to be able to start and grow a business on a level playing field with everybody else without any barriers in the way. And so we seek to build a world where we bring down these barriers for everybody to be able to realize that fundamental right. And we've got a three-pronged strategy to do it. The whole idea is to lift the voice of the entrepreneur up from the grassroots, up to the grass tops, up from the ordinary everyday person up to the leaders in society. And so we do that through, we call it changing policies, changing communities, and changing minds. So changing policies, the direct policymaker engagement, where we're helping shape the policies. And so that's working. We've touched all 50 states in some way or other, the national government, countless cities, like supporting and helping educate policymakers on how to help entrepreneurs better. The second piece is around changing communities, which is the activism. So getting people to know that you can get involved. You can have meetups with your policymakers and leaders. And it's not just like changing laws, like the way your school districts are run, the way that chambers of commerce engage with entrepreneurs, the way that communities, farmers markets all deal with entrepreneurs. All those things can be shaped without having to change any laws. It's just through engagement, citizen action and engagement. And the third piece is changing minds, which is the stories. And as I mentioned, kind of lifting up this issue in the American consciousness in a way that people realize this is just as important as all these other important issues of our day that don't get talked about. And so we do that. We're actively on the ground. So we're building coalitions, and we have 11 states this year that we're building some kind of, we call them starters coalitions, either full-on people on the ground staffed with a coalition manager, with a grassroots organizer, or virtual coalitions where we do, through Zoom calls, and we're able to start organizing people and lifting up these issues. It's just blocking and tackling at the human to human level, changing the way people think about this issue. One thing that's coming up this year, and this is a preview of 2025 and 2026 for us, is this whole issue of why entrepreneurship is important is tied into where we think America is at the moment, which is we just got through, a rough election cycle here. There is a sense across party lines, across America, across geography, coast to coast, that something America is kind of not working. Like it's sort of, the country is just kind of stuck and it's kind of broken. It's dysfunctional. There's a lot of division. And there's even a sense that we're losing it somehow. Like we're a bit in decline. And yet at the same time, there is a strong urge to say, well, we can fix this. We need to turn this country around. And so this idea of how do we renew America? It's time for a reboot in this country. And that the way you cannot do that without entrepreneurs at the very front of that, because entrepreneurs are the ones who build the future. Entrepreneurs are the ones who see a gap, who see a need, who see a problem, and come up with a better way to do things, and then bring that idea to life. So the idea is that we need to renew this country and put entrepreneurs at the very front, because entrepreneurs are going to be at the very leading edge of how to rebuild. And therefore, you've got to support entrepreneurship in all its many different forms, from someone building a unicorn tech startup to someone starting something in their garage or their basement or their living room, or someone's selling something on the street. You just never know what's going to take off. And ultimately, we're a better society when everyone gets a chance to sort of bring that new idea to do things better to life.
Yeah. So when you talk about removing some of these barriers, right? It could be the mortgage, it could be childcare, it could be healthcare. Is there one when you've talked to entrepreneurs that is like the predominant 800-pound gorilla, where if that was removed, it's like the biggest one that kind of unblocks that river where it flows much more freely? Or are these all kind of equally weighted? So it makes the challenge harder because you have to tackle multiple ones at the same time versus maybe focusing on the big rock.
Yeah, we've done polling around this, which is, if you didn't start a business, why didn't you start it? If you started it, what's in your way? Yeah, the bad news is it's everything. Everything gets in the way. It's a multi-pronged problem, which is the issue, right? It's like you can't solve it with just one thing. And so people have tried to help entrepreneurs before by building programs, tax subsidies, incentives, whatever. Well, how about all these other things? And so the issues go from capital access to red tape to knowledge and information access to healthcare to childcare to mortgages to non-compete restrictions to everything else. You really have to tackle the whole realm of everything that affects the entrepreneurial journey, which is essentially everything. Now, if you do poll people, people will say capital access very quickly. It's a bit of a false signal because money in a way can't solve everything. Like you throw enough money at red tape, you can solve red tape. You throw enough money at healthcare, you can get healthcare. And so the question is, well, why is there so much red tape? Why is healthcare so hard to access? And so money and capital is, of course, critical. And there's a lot to be said around the dysfunction of the capital markets around entrepreneurship. It's really great at the high-performing venture-backed companies that are really taken off, especially companies that have got some traction and they're really starting to launch. We've got a phenomenal VC industry for that in America, unparalleled, I think, in the world, maybe other than Israel, or a few places where you can compare. But for capital to kind of get you to that point, it's not so clear. It's so clear-cut. Like, people trying to raise $20,000 to buy a food truck because they want to, they've got a great recipe that's killing it, with their neighbors, but they can't afford to get a food truck, or $5,000 just to be able to pay for some license fees to be able to get your company going because it's a regulated area. Those things are serious, and we don't have a capital market system that actually helps that at all. In fact, it inhibits it severely right now.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So the other thing that you mentioned is about the vibe and the feel in Silicon Valley that, you try to replicate. And, I think about some of the analogies that I've heard and experienced in my life, right? Like Ho Chi Minh City versus Hanoi, right? Or Shanghai versus Beijing. And there is that kind of more hustle bustle business mindset, if you will. But who doesn't want a little bit more hustle bustle and commerce and growth, right? But so if a lot of areas want this, but how does one think about replicating that? Because that seems incredibly hard because, everyone would want some of that, seemingly.
Yes, it's the hardest thing to tackle. It's sort of like, what culture eats strategy for breakfast, the idea that ultimately culture wins everything. Like it's so much more valuable and actually it's what lawyers know as well, which is the habits are actually far more effective than laws. Like you can tell people this is illegal, but their habits are actually much better at shaping the long-term prospects of people getting to do something. And so you cannot really tackle entrepreneurship without tackling that issue of sort of how do you generate hustle where it doesn't exist. The way we've really tried to tackle that at Right to Start, you've got to take a multifaceted approach to all of it. So we think of it as basically from K through 12. Like if you think of the way K through 12 is designed right now, what is it geared for? Well, it's test taking. It's an industrial, it's a 20th century system for 21st century entrepreneurial skills. And so it's test taking, it's very regulated, it's formalized. But if you look within the education sector, there is a tremendous grassroots movement around project-based learning, design thinking for kids, applied entrepreneurial skills in many different forms of what that might take, which is real-world problem solving and doing stuff and making stuff. So that's part of our agenda at Right to Start as well, which is putting that in there. That was when I was at the Kauffman Foundation, we put that as part of our work as well, which is putting applied learning as part of the entrepreneurial agenda. And amazingly, and maybe surprisingly to some folks, in part of our national polling, we asked people, what do Americans think of this idea that, kids who graduate from public schools or, high school should have the skills to start their own business someday? Over 80% Americans support that. And we are certainly not at 80% of schooling that does that right now. In fact, it's much closer to zero. It's probably in the 10 or 20% that even touches on that. By and large, Americans want this because they want their kids to be able to have self-sufficiency skills, to have a sense of agency in their lives. And we don't even provide that. And so it goes from K through 12 and then, and beyond. A lot of what happens now is you learn entrepreneurial skills in adulthood, which is almost like retrofitting your education. Like it's like sticking a new muffler on an old car at that point and hoping the car performs better. And people learn, but it is having to unlearn a lot of things you were taught all the way through K through 12 and even college.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's why, when we started our conversation, it's about people's first brush with it, like as a kid. As you talk about education, it starts, earlier on. And, if people have role models of entrepreneurs who, struggled, learned, grew, succeeded, and overcame, I think that's inspiring to people and helps them get their arms around it and see that that could be a viable path for them, especially now as with AI. And I think there's going to be a lot of disruption in the job market. And so people, when they get displaced, what are they going to do with their talents? If they, maybe some of these lost causes can become unlost causes as people lean into it, if they have the proper kind of mindset and role models to help them along the way.
The tools and the stories and the role models are everywhere now because of, the internet. It's just changed. I mean, those of us that remember what the world was like before know, it was pretty lonely and quiet before. Like you didn't, it's hard to find stories or hard to learn stuff. You hope the library had a book on the subject you're interested in. Now it's endless what you can learn. And yet, interestingly enough, we have all the tools to create almost anything. Like our pockets, we carry supercomputers around.
Yeah.
And yet most people are scared, right? They don't know how, they're terrified of doing something, which is so ironic. Like we're far more scared than we need to be. Like, in this age of sort of economic, prosperity compared to the history of the world. I'm not saying everyone's prosperous now, but compared to the history of the world, we're very fortunate to have, what we have now and to have all the tools at our fingertips. Yet most people, their limitations are mostly only in their own narratives in their head.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the role of the SBA in all this. So as, a 4-time entrepreneur, 3-time venture back, I don't think I ever used the SBA at all. And I just thought, it's because I'm a different venture-backed CEO, so I don't need to avail myself of the resources. But I've been talking to guests on the UnLost Cause show, and hardly anyone uses them, right? So I'm like, well, so I'm going to ask someone smarter than me. So Victor, what is the SBA's kind of mandate and role, and should that change to better support this right to start movement?
The thing about the SBA, and it's interesting when you go to Washington and you talk to congressmen or senators and you talk about entrepreneurship and small business, they'll say, oh, great. Well, the SBA handles that. And they think the SBA does everything for entrepreneurs. But the SBA has actually a very specific set of things it runs. It runs loan guarantees. It runs small business development centers, which are technical assistance centers for people that just like, hey, how do I start my business? And they walk into an office and they give them some basics on how to do it. And the SBA also runs the SBIC program, which is a small business investment company program, which back in the 60s and 70s actually helped jumpstart the venture capital industry, but has now evolved where it primarily supports spinouts from banks and private equity funds. So most people in the venture space don't even know much about SBIC. They've done some reforms recently, which are exciting. But I think that there's a disconnect between what people think the SBA actually should do and what it actually has the power to do. And no one really talks about that the needs of entrepreneurs and small businesses are so much greater than loan guarantees, technical assistance centers, and SBIC funds. And there's more. SBA does more than that. There are some phenomenal people there, and I know them. But even they, in private conversations, will tell you they're only supposed to do a few things. Like they're trying to do more and more, but they haven't been given the power truly to be able to help entrepreneurship writ large across all the economy. Because that power is spread between them, Treasury, Commerce, all the SBIR funding they do is spread across all the different agencies of government. If you knocked on the door of the White House right now and said, I'd like to talk to the person in charge of entrepreneurship, there is no one to talk to. There is no position. There's actually no position in charge of entrepreneurship in America. It's spread across all the different agencies. And so one of the core recommendations we have is, well, put someone in charge. Like, let's create a czar or whatever you want to call it for entrepreneurship or in small business in America, and have them coordinate all these different issues that affect it, from the issues we know about, like loan guarantees and such. But how about also childcare, healthcare, economic development, workforce training, educational reform, mortgage lending, all these things that affect entrepreneurs that never get brought into the entrepreneurial conversation. So that's really the opportunity, is to change it from, it's the SBA's job and we only give them a few tools to do it. to this is a problem that affects the entire economy at large.
Yeah. I mean, when you say it in that way, it makes total sense to me because their mandate are these swim lanes. But in my mind, in probably most citizens' minds, it's like, oh no, the SBA just helps entrepreneurship and it's like a one-stop shop. But now I get it that no one said they went there because they didn't need that swim lane at that time. They needed something different. So that's when they had to use their other mentors, their other systems, their friends, their alumni network to access different things, be it knowledge or support along the way.
The SBA has sort of become like when you go to Congress or even, the federal level in executive branch and say, hey, we got entrepreneurship. It's a convenient excuse for them to say, oh, it's those people's jobs. But it's actually not. Like no one ever gave them the power to make it their job. Like I think the SBA, the people there would be very thrilled if they were given more power and a bigger mandate to do stuff. They don't have it right now.
And is it more realistic to think that it would change something like that in the federal level first or more at the state level first I know there's different like effects that they can do, like federal tax versus state tax, but it feels like maybe a state might grok this and move a little bit quicker than the federal government.
So that's what we've been doing at Right to Start. Because the federal government, if you've read the news, has been a bit broken at certain points, and so actually I think the last Congress had the lowest number of laws passed in like 20 years or something. It's like we're at this point where it's not a high functioning part of America, but the state level, there's a lot of places where stuff can happen. And we have, since Right to Start was launched 4.5 years ago, we have had, I think, at least 20 states that have introduced over 55 bills called Right to Start Acts, or based off of our ideas to improve the entrepreneurial environment. Because states at that level, they're much closer to the ground. They're much closer to the entrepreneurs and the citizens, and they see the problems. And if you can talk to them, they want to know, and they want to know how to help, and they can get stuff done. We've been able to pass 2 Right to Start Acts this is in Missouri last year and Nevada the year before. And we've had at least 4 other states that by executive action have followed our ideas as well. And the first idea, basically, including the 2 laws that were passed, is what I was saying before, put someone in charge of entrepreneurship in your state. And so now in Nevada, there is a director of entrepreneurship in an office of entrepreneurship in the governor's office. In Missouri, they are actually hiring right now the office of entrepreneurship and the director of entrepreneurship. And then we've also been working with New Mexico, Kansas, Michigan, Indiana, Colorado, and we're seeing more and more movement now of people in these states to say, let's put someone in charge of this critical issue, which has never had anyone in charge of it before in our state.
So, and then in terms of like importance to the citizenry and then ROI, because I always hear this thing about when the government invests in science, like NASA, there's like a, 8x return because all these materials came and got spun out. Is there a similar like disproportional impact when you invest in entrepreneurial efforts where, it sparks jobs, it sparks tax revenue, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, right. The econometricians are really great, like at NASA, and to kind of show like the ripple effects of that money.
Yeah.
Tang. Most kids don't know what Tang is anymore, but that's that powdered orange drink. They used to run those NASA ads, like invented by NASA or something.
Yeah.
The ripple effects of entrepreneurship are enormous. Most people don't know this. In fact, we did a poll, and only 18% of Americans know this. What is the source of the majority of new jobs in America? Is it old companies, big companies, or new young companies? It's actually the new young companies are not just the source of majority, it's the source of almost all net job growth in the economy. The old companies actually shed jobs over time. The young companies are the ones that build them.
Yeah.
Most Americans don't know that. And so huge effects. We also know for every 1% increase in entrepreneurial activity in a state, there's a 2% corresponding decrease in the poverty rate in a state. So more entrepreneurs means less poverty. We also know, this is recent data from GoDaddy's Venture Forward unit, for every 1% increase in entrepreneurial activity in a county, there's a corresponding $500 increase in household income in that county. The ripple effect of entrepreneurship is not just in one home. It actually spreads across an entire region. That is, entrepreneurial activity benefits your neighbors as well. And so $500 a year average household wealth income per year is enormous based on raising entrepreneurship. So we can actually do a lot to address some of these fundamental issues around poverty, inequality, wealth creation through supporting entrepreneurship.
Yeah. And I would imagine with people hopefully living longer and longevity. And it's in the government and policymakers' best interest to keep the social coffers full and have people support themselves by making income and sparking entrepreneurship, and then also helping their neighbors and their community, like that $500 that you just cited.
It's a whole thing now. Actually, interestingly, entrepreneurship has been on the rise in the more senior set. So, like people, yeah, they call them encore entrepreneurs, or golden entrepreneurs is a term, which is your mind is still, still vibrant, and you've got the internet now. You've got tremendous tools where you can basically create stuff around the world that you couldn't do before. And people can do this at any age. There's also polling done on Gen Z, and the interest by Gen Z in entrepreneurship is through the roof. They all want independent agency. They're all kind of part of the hustle mindset. They like side gigs, right? A lot of these people, they do multiple things at once. And yet the political governmental system hasn't responded to that. It's kind of viewed as like a cute thing that young people do, as opposed to, well, maybe this mindset, this attitude is going to be really critical to our economic fortunes as a society. Maybe we should actually adjust our systems to meet that. It really interesting shifts right now, and we just need to take advantage of it. And this issue has never been at the forefront of the debate before, and we're getting it there.
Yeah. And so for the listeners that have like a nascent or simmering dream, when you were thinking about right to start and they haven't decided to jump or not, what advice would you tell them when they're thinking about this, or a sleepless night?
Well, I think, a lot of the way entrepreneurship has been portrayed in the media is very intimidating. In Silicon Valley, a lot of the culture will say, go big or go home, which is pretty terrifying for people. It's like, you mean if I'm not building $1 billion company, it's not worth it to anybody to try, which is totally not true. Like, one story is Mr. Ewing Kauffman himself, the creator of the Kauffman Foundation. Mid-1980s, he had a pharmaceutical company that was worth over $6 billion, which at the time, by modern standards is even big already, but even bigger by like 80s standards. Leading edge pharmaceutical company, one of the most innovative ones in the country. What people don't remember is how he started it back in 1950, selling health supplements from the trunk of his car as a salesman, like going door to door. And he would actually make them by grinding oyster shells in his house and putting them in the little bags to create calcium supplements and go to hospitals and sell these. This is how you build a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical company. And so when you're thinking about like, how do you build like great companies, you have to really realize it can come from anywhere. And you can start small. And so when people are thinking about the next steps to take, the goal is to start in some way. Don't listen to the folks that say go big or go home. Start, think of Mr. Kauffman, grinding oyster shells in his, basement and then selling them to hospitals. And then, 30 plus years later, it's a multi-billion-dollar pharma company. You don't know where it's going to go. And that's not just a one-time story. There's so many stories like that of someone who thought it was going to be this and it became that. And the problem is people are scared to start. So you've just got to start and get going, and you will learn along the way, and you will find people to help you along the way. So I think the main thing is talk to people. Don't shut up about it. Like, get out there. This is what Silicon Valley knows well, which is to talk. Like, talk to all the people you can. Learn everything you can about something, and talk to people, learn about it, and then start small and try it out. And if it doesn't work, change it up, try it a different way, and just keep on doing it that way. And you realize that's a pattern you can learn, and you can minimize your risk if you do it that way, which is how my parents did it as well. They started small, they tried it out, and kept going, and eventually it got bigger and bigger. And it's the same way. So people don't know how to do that now. It's actually kind of like for most people, it's kind of like a lost art or a forgotten skill.
And, Victor, since we're a community here at UnLost Cause and we're in it together, what ask would you have or request for this community as they're listening to this?
Join us at Right to Start. We need your voice. All the issues you're dealing with or are about to deal with, we're going to learn as you go, as you're building your new thing. Join us, because we need your voice and your stories and what you confront as part of our work. You can join if you go to righttostart.org. You can link in, and we've got an online hub where we're sharing kind of inside stories. We've got a newsletter. We are very careful about when we use it, just to share out important information to people. And there's times, if you're in that community, when we need help, or we could, there's a ways for you to contribute, we'll let you know. And so we're building this movement out, and we'd love to have you on board.
Great. And so my last question is, I can't help but notice, so I think you mentioned that your parents were immigrant educators. Is that correct? And now you are doing something similar. Instead of, like, yes, it's entrepreneurial, but you're actually educating and pushing for this cause for other people to shine. And I feel like teachers are so selfless that they sacrifice themselves for their students and pupils to shine. Have you noticed that symmetry before? Have you thought about it? Because I see this like symmetry, and a lot of things come to chat from childhood, and it kind of really struck me.
Oh, interesting. That's an interesting observation. I don't know. I will say this, which is the one thing I learned from my parents. My dad and mom, they both taught computer science. I kind of saw what that looked like, and they were also trained as like middle school and high school teachers in Taiwan. Which is what happened to a lot of the smartest kids back then, because they wanted them to teach, and so they would recruit young people to teach. What they had, both my parents, is the ability to take big, complicated concepts and make them easy to understand. And I watched that. In fact, my dad used to make me go to his classes he taught, just to kind of see how it happened. And so I was learning in high school. I was learning complex concepts of sort of computer engineering, but he would reduce it to the simplest concepts and simplest analogies and make it so straightforward that you couldn't help but understand something. And I think a right to start, that's probably something I do without even thinking about it, is to make it so simple. Because if you really get into this stuff can get very complicated, very wonky, very, very messy, very fast. But ultimately, you can break it down to its simplest concepts. It's just about giving people their basic rights to be able to express themselves. And if you can kind of take it to that, there's that phrase, the simplicity on the other side of complexity, which is if you can get through everything, problems look so messy and complicated when you kind of get into them. Once you get through them, you realize on the other side, it was actually very simple all along. And so what I'm trying to do now, having been at this work now for 25 years, is to try to get to the simplicity on the other side of complexity and show people how that works. Like, it's actually very, very simple. If you don't have to understand the way capital is structured in capital stack or cap tables. You don't have to understand the nuances of economic development policy and how incentives work. You don't have to understand how to cut red tape, through lean performance standards. You can work in your own part of it, right? And you can make sure that simple story of, here's the dream I'd like to build, and here's the barriers I'm facing. How can we, share that story? And then it's the job of the people that are the technicians to figure out how to make it better for you, right? And so that's the way I've really approached it, is to make it as simple as to understand as possible, and then give people the tools to be able to take action and express themselves.
Wow. So Victor, thank you so much for sharing your story and your incredible mission with us today. Your passion for championing entrepreneurial rights and building a national movement with Right to Start is nothing short of inspiring.
Thank you, David. Well, I appreciate what you're building here with UnLost Cause. What an inspiring topic for people. And I think that's the idea that we all have we all harbor a dream and we all want to bring it to life. And I think having a community of people that support each other is so meaningful, and it feeds right into the Right to Start movement as well. It's never too late.
Great. Before you go, if you're inspired and want to be a part of something bigger, subscribe, like, and share to help more people reclaim their dreams and live true to themselves. Also, let me know if you or someone you know would be an inspiring guest on this show. Together, let's spark courage to live without regrets. The UnLost Cause way, one story and one person at a time.